March 21, 1950. Over the Pacific Ocean. The sky above the Pacific was empty, save for a single lumbering aircraft, a C-97 Stratofreighter, an ungainly cargo plane with its belly full of fuel instead of freight. Below it, two silver bombers sliced through the clouds, their engines thirsty and their range nearly gone. Inside the C-97's cockpit, an engineer named William Bill Holmes adjusted the throttles, sweat gathering under his headset despite the sub-zero air. They weren't carrying food, mail, or ammunition. They were about to attempt something far stranger: refuel another aircraft while both were flying. From the ground, it looked impossible. Two planes, each weighing more than 100,000 pounds, flying barely 20 feet apart at hundreds of miles per hour. A single mistake, one slip, one gust of turbulence, and both would become fireballs in the ocean. But Holmes wasn't here to deliver cargo. He was here to make aviation history. The pilots in the bombers below were nearly out of fuel, and home was still hours away. The only hope now rested on the success of an idea that sounded insane when it first appeared in Air Force briefings: turn a cargo plane into a flying gas station. This C-97 had been gutted and rewired by American engineers desperate to solve a problem that was threatening the entire post-war strategy of the United States Air Force. The problem of distance. Bombers could fly far, but not far enough. The Soviet Union was half a world away, and the math didn't work. If America couldn't project its nuclear arsenal globally, deterrence itself could fail. Holmes flipped a switch, and the massive refueling boom extended from the C-97's tail. A gleaming metal spear designed to thread the sky like a needle. "Contact in 10, the boom operator called. The bomber below eased upward, the air vibrating with the sound of 4 synchronized engines. Then, with a tiny metallic click, the boom locked into place. Fuel began to flow through the line, 600 gallons per minute. For the first time in U.S. history, an aircraft that had been designed to haul crates and supplies was delivering fuel instead, to another plane still in flight. What began as an experiment in repurposing a transport plane would soon transform global air power forever. The cargo hauler had become something new, a lifeline in the sky. What these engineers had done wasn't just technical innovation. It was defiance of physics and instinct. A cargo plane wasn't meant to be a tanker, and midair refueling wasn't supposed to work. But necessity has always been the mother of invention, and in 1950, with the Cold War heating up, necessity meant teaching an airplane how to do the impossible. This is the story of how American engineers took a humble cargo plane, rewired its vanes with fuel lines, and turned it into the sky's first true airborne refueling station. A flying miracle that would change warfare, strategy, and the very meaning of range forever. By the spring of 1950, the United States Air Force had a problem that no number of bombers, pilots, or atomic bombs could solve: distance. The new enemy wasn't a nation, it was geography. The dawn of the Cold War had redrawn the map of warfare. The Soviet Union stretched across 11 time zones, from the Baltic to the Pacific. Its industrial heartland, the targets that mattered, lay thousands of miles from any American base. The U.S. had the B-29 Superfortress, the same aircraft that had ended World War II, but it wasn't enough anymore. Even the upgraded B-50 could barely reach the edges of Soviet territory and make it back. And with the newly built B-36 Peacemaker, boasting 6 engines and the wingspan of a football field, the limits weren't in the aircraft's size or power, they were in its fuel tanks. Each new bomber design could carry more bombs, fly higher, and travel faster. But the one thing engineers couldn't invent on the drawing board was range. Fuel weighed too much. Adding more tanks only made the aircraft heavier, which meant it burned more fuel, which meant, ironically, it flew shorter distances. The math was merciless. At Strategic Air Command Headquarters in Omaha, generals stared at wall maps covered in red lines representing bomber routes to Moscow, Leningrad, and Vladivostok. Each line ended prematurely, arcing down into the icy Arctic or the endless Pacific, the lines of no return. It wasn't just a logistical issue. It was a question of survival. Without aerial refueling, the U.S. nuclear deterrent was a paper tiger. A bomber that couldn't reach its target, or couldn't return, wasn't a deterrent at all. It was a suicide mission. As one Air Force memo from the era bluntly stated, "Our reach defines our relevance. Without extended range, the bombers will fail before the first bomb is ever dropped." Forward bases offered no real solution. Building airfields close enough to the Soviet Union meant placing thousands of men and tons of fuel within easy range of Soviet bombers. Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, all were freezing, remote, and vulnerable. Even worse, the Air Force had no reliable method to extend flight endurance midair. The British had experimented with crude hose and grapple systems before World War II, but they were unstable and dangerous. And so, the Air Force found itself trapped in a paradox. It could build the most advanced aircraft in the world, but it couldn't keep them in the air long enough to use them effectively. America's global dominance, the very credibility of its strategic deterrence, was limited by the simple fact that fuel tanks ran dry. If engineers couldn't find a way to refuel in the sky, safely, reliably, repeatedly, the dream of a global air force would collapse before it ever began. The bombers could fly high, they could fly fast, but without fuel above the clouds, they could never fly far enough. The race to turn a cargo plane into a flying gas station wasn't just about engineering ingenuity. It was about redefining what was possible, or facing a future where America's most powerful weapons ran out of gas halfway to their targets. December 1946, at a newly established Air Force base in Kansas, a test pilot named Major Robert Thacker was sitting in the cockpit of a modified B-29 bomber, staring at a flight plan that seemed like wishful thinking. The objective was simple on paper: fly from Honolulu to New York without stopping. But the math on the clipboard told a different story. Even stripped of unnecessary weight, the bomber didn't have the fuel to make it. Every gallon burned meant fewer miles remaining. Every pound of fuel added to the tanks made the aircraft heavier, forcing the engines to burn even more fuel just to stay aloft. It was a paradox that haunted aviation from its earliest days. The further you tried to go, the harder it became to get there. The mission was cancelled that day, not because the engines failed, but because the math did. The problem wasn't courage or technology. It was physics. Air resistance increased exponentially with speed. Engine efficiency decreased as altitude and weight changed. And fuel, the one thing you needed most, worked against you the moment you carried too much of it. A bomber like the B-29 Superfortress carried roughly 9,000 gallons of aviation fuel. That gave it a maximum range of about 3,500 miles in ideal conditions. On paper, that seemed impressive. But if a mission required a long route to avoid enemy radar, bad weather, or a return flight to base, that range shrank drastically. For a world map measured in continents, 3,500 miles wasn't power, it was confinement. The Soviet Union's key industrial cities, Moscow, Gorky, Stalingrad, sat far beyond the red circle drawn on Air Force maps, showing the B-29's combat radius. And bombers couldn't simply refill at sea. Fuel depots didn't float. Strategists tried to solve the problem with new designs. The B-36 Peacemaker, introduced in 1948, could theoretically fly from Texas to Leningrad and back, but only under perfect weather, perfect weight, and perfect luck. Reality rarely offered any of those. The bigger problem wasn't building a long-range bomber. It was building enough of them, and keeping them in the sky for long enough to matter. Without a reliable method of aerial refueling, every mission was a gamble against fuel gauges. The idea of mid-air refueling wasn't new. It had been floating, literally, since 1923, when two U.S. Army Air Service aircraft performed the world's first in-flight fuel transfer over San Diego. It was a daring experiment. Two biplanes flying just feet apart, one lowering a rubber hose while the other caught it with a weighted line. The crew poured fuel manually through a funnel, refueling like farmers filling a tank. It worked, barely, but it was dangerous, awkward, and completely impractical for combat operations. Still, the record was set: 37 hours of continuous flight. Newspapers hailed it as the birth of endless flight. But endless flight required endless coordination. For the next 2 decades, the concept lived on the fringes of aviation research, mostly as publicity stunts. Crews refueled in the air to break endurance records, but no one considered it a tactical tool. During World War II, the British revisited the idea with their flight refueling latitude experiments. Their looped hose system used a drogue, a small parachute, trailing behind the tanker aircraft. The receiver would snag the line with a hook, connect the hose, and transfer fuel. It worked in theory. In practice, it was a nightmare. Turbulence, hose kinks, and fuel pressure fluctuations caused near misses and several fatal accidents. When the war ended, the Allies had mastered flight at high altitudes, radar bombing, and jet propulsion. But aerial refueling still looked like a stunt, not a solution. In 1947, the United States Air Force became an independent branch. Its leaders, especially General Curtis LeMay of Strategic Air Command, were obsessed with one word: reach. The new global chessboard demanded aircraft that could fly from America to anywhere, without asking anyone for permission to land. LeMay was blunt. Our bombers must not depend on geography. Geography changes. The mission doesn't. But geography still had the final say. The U.S. could not rely on bases in Europe or Asia forever. As the Iron Curtain descended, forward bases became political liabilities and tactical vulnerabilities. LeMay needed a way to make a bomber based in Nebraska capable of reaching Moscow and returning without landing. In essence, he needed a moving base in the sky. Let's run the numbers the way engineers did in 1948. A B-29 at cruising altitude burned approximately 250 gallons per hour per engine. That's 1,000 gallons an hour total. A mission to the Soviet border and back required nearly 14 hours of flight time. That's 14,000 gallons, far more than the plane could carry. Even with auxiliary tanks and stripped-down payloads, it wasn't enough. The conclusion was unavoidable. If bombers were to fly missions that truly spanned the globe, they had to take fuel with them, or meet someone who could give them more along the way. But that someone couldn't be on the ground. He had to be in the air. By 1949, the Air Force was commissioning feasibility studies. Could a cargo aircraft, large, stable, and already capable of carrying vast amounts of fuel, be converted into a flying tanker? On paper, it was simple. Put fuel tanks in a transport plane and run hoses out the back. In reality, the challenges were staggering. How to safely transfer pressurized fuel without explosion risk. How to keep both aircraft stable at 250 plus mph. How to build a system flexible enough to connect mid-air, but strong enough to withstand turbulence. At the time, no engineer could answer all 3 questions confidently. But necessity was louder than doubt. The problem of distance, that ancient adversary of every aviator since the Wright brothers, was about to be challenged head-on. Not by new engines, not by lighter metals, but by a radical idea that the sky itself could become a refueling station. The cargo planes sitting on airfields across America, once meant to carry supplies and troops, were about to be reimagined. Their cavernous bellies would no longer haul crates. They'd carry lifeblood for the aircraft that carried the nation's hopes. The only question left was how. August 1939. While most of Europe was bracing for war, a small airfield in Surrey, England was witnessing an experiment that looked more like a circus act than a military trial. 2 aircraft flew in formation, a Handley Page bomber leading, a twin-engine Avro trailing closely behind. From the bomber's tail, a thin hose whipped in the wind. The trailing aircraft reached out with a grappling hook fixed to its nose. To onlookers below, it seemed suicidal. 2 aircraft closing within just 30 feet at over 200 miles an hour. But inside the lead plane, a British engineer named Sir Alan Cobham was about to do something that could rewrite aviation history. Transfer fuel between 2 aircraft in flight. The hose latched. Fuel began to flow. For the first time, one plane fed another midair. The crowd of engineers erupted in applause, and yet almost no one outside that airfield cared. Sir Alan Cobham was an eccentric visionary. A former Royal Air Force pilot turned entrepreneur. He had spent the 1920s performing long-distance flights to showcase British aviation. He flew from London to Cape Town, from England to Australia. See the modern Titan, Ryan, always pushing the limits of aircraft endurance. But he understood something that few others did. Speed and power didn't define the future of flight. Endurance did. In 1934, he founded Flight Refueling Limited, FRL, dedicated to one idea, that planes shouldn't have to land to refuel. Cobham's concept was radical. Instead of stopping for fuel, why not make the sky itself a service station? He spent years perfecting a system that used a looped hose mechanism. A tanker aircraft trailed a line, and the receiving plane would catch it with a hook. Once the loop was secure, the hose would reel in, connect, and start pumping fuel. It worked, sometimes. The first successful mid-air refueling using Cobham's system took place in 1939, when a modified Handley Page Harrow tanker refueled a short Empire flying boat. The experiment allowed a passenger plane to cross the Atlantic non-stop for the first time. It was a staggering achievement, but wartime priorities quickly shifted. The Royal Air Force, now focused on defending Britain during the Blitz, saw no place for aerial refueling in combat. Fighter aircraft had neither the time nor stability to line up for such delicate maneuvers, and even for large aircraft, the early system was unreliable. Hoses tangled, pressure fluctuated, and one bad gust of wind could rip the connection apart. In an era before digital stabilization or autopilots, precision was almost impossible. Cobham's system proved a point. It could be done, but not yet. How to do it safely, reliably, and repeatedly. When the war ended, the United States was watching closely. American test pilots and engineers, studying British innovation reports, recognized that Cobham's system was more than a curiosity. It was a potential strategic revolution. In 1947, the newly formed United States Air Force quietly purchased the rights to Cobham's flight refueling patents. The idea was simple. If the British could connect 2 aircraft mid-air with ropes and hooks, surely the Americans could find a way to do it with precision engineering. But the challenges were daunting. The British had operated at low speeds, under 200 mm with piston aircraft. American bombers like the B-50 and fighters like the F-84 Thunderjet were pushing 400 mph. At those speeds, the looped hose system was as dangerous as it was outdated. Still, Cobham's groundwork gave the Americans something priceless, a proof of concept. The air could be refueled. It was no longer a myth or a dream. It was a technical problem waiting to be solved. By 1948, joint demonstrations between FRL and the U.S. Air Force were underway. The British used converted Lancasters and Lincolns as tankers, while the Americans experimented with their B-29 superfortresses as receivers. The highlight came that year when a refueled aircraft flew non-stop from London to New York, a journey that, until then, had required either mid-ocean landings or staggering fuel reserves. It was the moment that convinced the Pentagon brass aerial refueling was no longer experimental. It was essential, as one U.S. Air Force colonel later remarked. We realized we didn't need more range in our engines. We needed more sky to be useful. Despite its success, the British system had fatal flaws for military application. The hose connection was manual and unpredictable. It required both aircraft to fly dangerously close for extended periods, and it was completely dependent on pilot eyesight. No sensors, no guidance. In peacetime, those problems were tolerable. In combat, they were suicidal. But Cobham's system planted the seed. It showed that midair refueling wasn't science fiction. It was engineering waiting for iteration. And the Americans, with their growing global ambitions and engineering capacity, were the ones to take it from daring stunt to standard doctrine. In late 1948, engineers at Boeing and Fairchild began studying FRL's blueprints under a classified Air Force directive. They admired Cobham's innovation, but decided to abandon the hose and hook design entirely. They needed something faster, stronger, and smarter. A refueling system that could work at jet speeds, through turbulence, with no reliance on visual luck. Something that could be controlled, measured, and repeated. That something would emerge from the laboratories of Boeing's Wichita division within 2 years. And it would begin with a single question. What if, instead of catching a hose, we could aim one? June 1948, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. In a drafty hangar filled with the smell of oil and aviation fuel, a group of American engineers gathered around the stripped fuselage of a B-29 superfortress. The bomber, once a weapon of victory in World War II, now sat like a patient on an operating table. But this was no repair. It was a transformation. On the chalkboard behind them, an engineer had written 3 words in block letters: Flying Gas Station Project. The idea had crossed the Atlantic along with a box of blueprints, the plans for Sir Alan Cobham's looped hose refueling system. The Air Force had bought the rights from Flight Refueling Limited, but the Americans had no intention of copying it. They respected Cobham's ingenuity, but his method was, as one colonel put it, a gentleman's trick, not a soldier's tool. It was elegant, but fragile, and fragility had no place in the coming Cold War. What the Americans needed was a system that could survive turbulence, stress, and chaos, something a pilot could use without performing aerial ballet. The British had built a working concept. The Americans would build a working weapon. The first test bed for the U.S. version of Cobham's idea was a modified B-29 bomber called the KB-29M. K for tanker, B for bomber. Engineers from Boeing and Fairchild Aircraft tore out the bomb bay and replaced it with massive fuel tanks, pumps, and reels. The early design still used a flexible hose, trailing from the aircraft's belly or tail. A receiver plane, usually another bomber, would fly below and behind it, trying to catch the hose with a grappling line. Once hooked, the tanker would reel the hose taut and begin transferring fuel using hydraulic pumps. In theory, it worked exactly like Cobham's model. In practice, it was a nightmare. The KB-29M's hose whipped violently in the jet wash, creating turbulence so severe that it occasionally struck the receiving aircraft's fuselage. The Air Force lost several prototypes before engineers realized that at 250 miles per hour, even a half-inch fuel hose could act like a steel whip. Pilots joked grimly that refueling felt like trying to lasso a snake while flying through a hurricane. But even when the hose connected, problems persisted. The pressure differential between the tanker and receiver caused erratic fuel flow. The slightest pitch or yaw from either aircraft could cause the line to snap, and on long missions, hose icing at altitude sometimes froze the entire system solid. Still, the failures were useful. Each flight generated pages of data, airflow dynamics, hose oscillation frequencies, fuel pressure curves, that the engineers at Boeing analyzed obsessively. One of them, a young aeronautical engineer named Charles L. Rodman, wrote a memo that changed everything. In it, he described a simple but radical idea. Instead of a trailing hose that must be caught, build a controllable boom that can be aimed. Rodman's concept shifted the paradigm. Instead of relying on the receiver to catch the hose, the tanker itself would reach out, like a spear guided by human hands. Boeing engineers began designing what they called the flying boom. It was a rigid, telescoping tube mounted at the tail of the tanker, connected to hydraulic controls that allowed a dedicated crew member, soon called the boom operator, Cedries, to steer it using small aerodynamic fins. This innovation flipped the entire process on its head. Now, the tanker did the work of aligning and maintaining contact, while the receiving aircraft simply flew in formation. The tanker could adjust for turbulence, correct alignment errors, and maintain a steady fuel flow. Even at speeds approaching 300 mm, the first prototype was mounted on a B-29 in late 1949, and the test results were staggering. Stability improved by 70%. Fuel transfer rates nearly tripled. One Air Force officer watching the test famously muttered, "That's not a hose, that's evolution." With the boom came a new job, the boomer. Seated in the tail section of the tanker, facing backward, the boom operator controlled the telescopic arm with a set of control sticks that adjusted small fins on the boom's surface. The system demanded coordination between three people: the tanker pilot, the receiver pilot, and the boom operator. All communicating over radio and performing a synchronized ballet at hundreds of miles per hour. The first successful test refueling of a B-50 bomber occurred on July 14, 1949, using the prototype KB-29P, an evolution of the earlier hose-based KB-29M. The moment fuel began flowing through the rigid boom, the flight engineer shouted, "Contact steady!" over the intercom. For the Air Force, that phrase became the equivalent of, "The Eagle has landed." The success proved that the concept worked, and it worked better than anyone dared hope. The boom system allowed safe, repeatable refueling in nearly any weather. Suddenly, the limits that had bound aviation for 50 years evaporated. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. The first booms leaked, froze, and occasionally jammed. Engineers had to design specialized couplings that could handle high-pressure fuel transfer without sparks or vapor lock. The rigid structure introduced new risks. Collisions during connection attempts were common, and one mistimed maneuver could shear the boom entirely. But the fundamentals were sound. For the first time, fuel transfer rates exceeded 600 gallons per minute, fast enough to refuel a heavy bomber in under 10 minutes. More importantly, the process could be done at altitude, above the weather, beyond enemy radar. The refueling boom wasn't just a mechanical device, it was a statement. America no longer needed to ask permission from geography. In 1950, the Air Force officially adopted the Boeing boom system as standard. The KB-29P became the first operational tanker fleet, its success paving the way for a purpose-built design, the KC-97 Stratafreighter, Sadr, which would soon transform from an awkward hybrid into the backbone of Strategic Air Command. What had begun as an experiment born of desperation was now a new branch of aerial science, airborne logistics. The flying gas station was no longer an idea. It was reality. The next step would be turning that experimental tanker into a production aircraft that could serve every bomber in the fleet. A challenge that would require rethinking not just fuel systems, but the very aerodynamics of cargo planes. And that's where the next chapter begins. July 1950, Wichita, Kansas. The morning sun glinted off the polished aluminum skin of a massive aircraft sitting on Boeing's assembly line. From a distance, it looked like another C-97 Stratofreighter, the standard cargo workhorse of the U.S. Air Force. But a closer look revealed something different. A strange, spear-like mechanism extending from its tail, ending in a telescoping metal tube. The markings on the fuselage read KB-29P, but the engineers working on it knew it by another name, whispered half-jokingly around the hangar. The flying gas station. This was the world's first operational tanker aircraft, capable of refueling bombers and fighters mid-flight. It wasn't a prototype anymore. It was the beginning of a revolution in aviation. The transformation from cargo hauler to tanker wasn't as simple as strapping on a fuel hose. It required re-engineering the aircraft from the inside out. The C-97's cavernous fuselage made it an ideal platform, large enough to carry multiple internal fuel tanks while maintaining space for pumps, hoses, and the new flying boom system. Boeing engineers stripped out the cargo deck and replaced it with 6 massive aluminum tanks, each capable of holding thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. The tanks were pressurized, interconnected, and regulated by an intricate web of valves that ensured consistent flow even during banking or turbulence. At the heart of it all was the refueling boom, controlled by a trained boom operator who lay prone in the rear fuselage, watching the receiver aircraft through a thick plexiglass window. He was the heart of the operation, a human conductor orchestrating the precise ballet of flight, pressure, and motion. The flying boom was unlike anything seen in aviation before. Roughly 50 feet long, the boom could extend and retract hydraulically. Small, movable fins near its tip, called ruddervators, allowed the operator to fly the boom up, down, and side to side using a joystick. When the receiver aircraft approached, the boom operator guided the telescopic nozzle into a refueling receptacle located on the bomber's upper fuselage. Once locked, the operator opened the fuel valve and began transferring up to 600 gallons per minute, enough to fill a fighter jet in under 3 minutes. Communication was everything. The tanker pilot, receiver pilot, and boom operator maintained constant radio contact, calling out altitude changes, closure rates, and fuel flow metrics. A typical exchange sounded like this: tanker steady, boom clear, receiver closing, contact made. It was all routine now, but in 1950, it was a miracle of coordination. The first major test of the KB-29P tanker system came during Operation Fox Peter I, a transatlantic deployment of B-50 Superfortresses in 1950. The bombers took off from the U.S. East Coast, refueled midair over the Atlantic, and continued to the United Kingdom without landing. For the first time in American history, a combat-ready bomber fleet had effectively erased the Atlantic Ocean. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, the mastermind behind Strategic Air Command, reportedly stood before a wall map of Europe after the operation and said only one sentence: "Now, every target on Earth is in range." The success of the KB-29P program proved beyond question that aerial refueling was no longer experimental. It was essential. Encouraged by the success of the KB-29P conversions, Boeing engineers went further. In 1951, they introduced a dedicated refueling aircraft, the KC-97 Stratofreighter. Unlike the earlier modified bombers, the KC-97 was built from the ground up to serve as a tanker. It was based on the C-97 cargo airframe, but optimized for stability, range, and fuel flow capacity. It carried nearly 9,000 gallons of fuel, with advanced pumping systems capable of refueling multiple aircraft in sequence. The KC-97 could cruise at 300 km/h, fast enough for most piston-engine bombers, but still too slow for the new jet aircraft beginning to enter service. That mismatch would become a problem soon enough. But for now, the KC-97 represented a triumph of engineering pragmatism. The Air Force called it the flying pipeline. Crews called it a lifeline. Flying the tanker was only half the job. WWII. Operating it was an art form. Every boom operator had to undergo months of specialized training at Castle Air Force Base in California. They learned not only the physics of flight and hydraulics, but also the psychology of teamwork. In the chaos of a storm or at night over the Atlantic, the boom operator's calm voice often made the difference between success and disaster. One instructor described the job this way: "You're lying on your stomach, staring out a glass window, and the only thing between you and the other plane is a metal pole full of jet fuel. You don't move, you flow." Refueling missions became precision choreography. Tankers launched first, established racetrack flight paths, and circled in waiting zones while bombers climbed to meet them. Timing was everything. A single delay could strand an entire bomber, formation short of its target. With tankers now supporting long-range bombers, the United States gained what no other air force had: true global reach. Strategic Air Command could launch bombers from Kansas and have them strike anywhere on Earth, refueled in flight, and return without touching foreign soil. To the public, it seemed abstract, one more technical marvel in an age of endless innovation. But to the men flying those missions, it was survival. The tanker crews became the unsung heroes of deterrence, unseen, unarmed, but indispensable. Every successful mission depended on them. Without the flying gas stations, the world's most advanced bombers were just short-range giants. By 1953, more than 800 KC-97s were in production. Their presence transformed how the Air Force thought about warfare. Range was no longer a limitation. The Cold War's boundaries had been redrawn, not by new weapons, but by fuel and imagination. Each KC-97 carried not just gasoline, but strategy. The ability to refuel in the sky meant that the U.S. could project power, respond instantly, and remain airborne indefinitely. One Air Force historian later summarized it best: "The bombers carried the threat. The tankers carried the possibility." The world now had a new kind of aircraft, one that didn't drop bombs or fire guns, yet quietly reshaped global power. And as jet technology advanced, another challenge loomed. The KC-97 was fast for a propeller plane, but too slow for the jet bombers coming online. The Air Force needed a tanker that could keep up. The engineers who had just turned a cargo plane into a flying gas station would now have to invent something even more ambitious: a jet-powered refueling platform. March 1953, RAF Lakenheath, England. In the grey pre-dawn light, the roar of engines shattered the silence. A formation of KC-97 Stratofreighters lifted from the runway one after another, their wings heavy with fuel and frost. Above them, a group of B-47 Stratojets streaked toward the horizon, the first generation of jet-powered bombers the United States had ever fielded. The plan was simple on paper. The slower KC-97s would refuel the B-47s halfway across the Atlantic, extending their range and proving that the new jet bomber could strike anywhere in the world. But, as the bombers approached the rendezvous point, the pilots realized the flaw in the plan: speed. The KC-97s topped out at 300 mph. The B-47s cruised at 500. To connect for refueling, the bombers had to throttle back so hard that they nearly fell from the sky, flying nose up at the edge of stall speed. It was a dangerous balancing act, one that could kill both aircraft if either lost control. Still, they managed it. In a narrow band of air over the freezing Atlantic, the world's first jet bombers met the lumbering piston-driven tankers, WWII, and history was made again. The KC-97 Stratofreighter had done its job brilliantly for piston aircraft, but by 1953, it was already a dinosaur. The new generation of jet-powered bombers, the B-47 Stratojet, and later the B-52 Stratofortress, demanded a faster, higher-flying, more efficient tanker. Still, the KC-97 remained indispensable. At the height of the Korean War and into the early Cold War, it became the logistical backbone of American air power. Tanker squadrons fanned out across the globe, stationed in Guam, England, Greenland, and Japan, creating a network of aerial gas stations that allowed the United States to maintain bomber patrols around the clock. Each KC-97 carried 3 crew sections: pilots up front, flight engineers in the middle, and boom operators in the tail. A typical mission lasted over 12 hours, with the tanker flying lazy racetrack orbits waiting for its assigned receivers. Crews joked that the KC-97 didn't fly. It floated through the sky like a flying gas tank. But for all its slowness, it gave Strategic Air Command something priceless: endurance. Bombers could now stay aloft for 20 hours, loiter near targets, or reposition mid-mission. It was power projection made real. By 1954, aerial refueling was no longer a novelty. It was standard doctrine. Tankers became as critical to planning as runways. Each major airbase had assigned tanker corridors, and mission planners carefully calculated rendezvous points down to the minute. The concept was called Operation Reflex, and it turned the entire planet into an invisible web of airborne highways. Bomber groups could now reach Moscow, return, and still have enough fuel to divert to alternate bases. At the height of the program, more than 800 KC-97s flew in service, operating from bases as far apart as Spain, Alaska, and Okinawa. One of the E2 most remarkable missions took place in 1957, when a KC-97 refueled a B-52 multiple times during Operation Power Flight, the first non-stop, around-the-world flight by jet bombers. The mission took 45 hours and covered 24,225 miles without landing. Once, 5 KC-97s supported the mission, the unsung engines behind the triumph. When the bombers landed at March Air Force Base, their crews were greeted as heroes. Few mentioned the tanker crews who had quietly kept them alive for 2 days straight. For the boom operators and pilots, the KC-97 was both a marvel and a menace. The boom operator lay prone in the tail, staring at the receiver aircraft only a few dozen feet away, sometimes at night or in driving rain. The job required nerves of steel and endless repetition. One veteran boomer described it this way: "You can't think of it as 2 airplanes. You have to think of it as one, connected by a thread. Move wrong, and you break the thread, or worse." Refueling in turbulence was particularly brutal. A single downdraft could yank the boom out of alignment, tearing metal or snapping the connection. Crews practiced endlessly in simulators, but nothing truly prepared them for the chaos of real-world weather. Despite the risks, morale among tanker crews was high. They took pride in the quiet heroism of their work. While fighter pilots and bomber crews got the headlines, tanker units knew that without them, none of those missions could happen. As one KC-97 squadron motto declared, "No one flies far without us." By the mid-1950s, however, engineers were hitting a wall. The KC-97's propeller engines simply couldn't climb fast enough to match jet speeds. On every refueling mission with B-47s, bombers had to drop down from their optimal cruising altitudes and throttle back dangerously low. The mismatch became a tactical liability. The Air Force's new strategy, constant airborne alert, demanded a tanker that could accompany jet bombers on long-range, high-speed patrols. In 1954, the Air Force approached Boeing with a challenge: build a tanker that could fly as fast as the bombers it supported. The solution would come from an unexpected place: a secret Boeing prototype that had nothing to do with refueling and everything to do with the future of commercial aviation. Boeing had been quietly developing a prototype jet transport known as the Model 367-80E, or simply the Dash 80. Designed as the test bed for what would become the world's first successful commercial jetliner, the Boeing 707, it was sleek, fast, and efficient. When the Air Force saw it, they realized it could serve double duty, as both a passenger jet and a high-speed aerial tanker. The engineers at Boeing began reconfiguring the Dash 80 into a military variant, the KC-135 Stratotanker. The KC-135 would solve every problem that plagued the KC-97: higher speed, pressurized cabins, jet engines that could climb to 40,000 feet, and refueling booms that could handle modern fuel demands. The cargo plane turned tanker had proven the concept. Now, America was about to perfect it. By the time the first KC-135 flew in 1956, the United States had built a global system of refueling routes, bases, and trained crews, all because engineers had once looked at a transport aircraft and asked, what if this carried fuel instead of freight? The KC-97 was the bridge between two eras, the last of the piston-driven giants and the foundation for jet-age dominance. As one historian later wrote, the KC-97 didn't just refuel aircraft, it refueled the imagination of what air power could be. From humble cargo conversions to global nuclear deterrence, the flying gas station had evolved from prototype to indispensable power. But the next leap, the jet tanker revolution, would transform aerial refueling from a logistical trick into the beating heart of modern warfare. July 31, 1956, Renton Field, Washington. A crowd of engineers, Air Force officers, and Boeing executives stood on the tarmac, shielding their eyes against the morning glare. A sleek, silver aircraft with swept-back wings and 4 jet engines hummed at the end of the runway. Painted on its tail were 3 simple characters: KC-135A. When its wheels left the ground that day, history took flight again. The jet age had officially arrived, not just for passengers, but for the refueling backbone of American air power. The KC-135 Stratotanker wasn't just an improvement over the KC-97, it was an entirely new species of aircraft, faster, stronger, and designed from nose to tail for one purpose: keeping America's bombers and fighters in the sky indefinitely. By the mid-1950s, the Air Force's fleet of B-47 Stratojets and B-52 Stratofortresses had outgrown their piston-engine tankers. The B-47 could cruise at 500 miles per hour and at altitudes above 35,000 feet. The poor KC-97, struggling to keep up, could barely reach 300 mph and often had to climb laboriously to meet its receivers. The mismatch wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. Jet bombers had to throttle back to near-stall speeds, dropping altitude to rendezvous with the slower tankers. One Air Force report noted that a B-47, in order to refuel from a KC-97, must fly in a regime so inefficient that the receiver is burning more fuel than it receives. It was unsustainable. The U.S. needed a tanker that could fly with the bombers, not chase them. Enter Boeing's Model 367-80, affectionately called the Dash 80. Originally developed as an experimental jet transport to explore commercial jetliner design, it caught the attention of Air Force engineers the moment it flew in 1954. With its four powerful Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojets, it could cruise above 500 meters and carry tons of fuel with ease. The Air Force and Boeing quickly reached an agreement. A militarized version of the Dash 80 would become the world's first jet-powered aerial refueling aircraft. Turning the Dash 80 into a tanker meant more than bolting a boom onto the tail. Engineers had to rethink nearly every system for military use. The KC-135A Stratotanker featured pressurized fuel tanks holding over 31,000 gallons of jet fuel. A fully integrated Mark IV flying boom system capable of transferring 1,000 gallons per minute. Reinforced wings and fuselage to handle the strain of carrying massive loads at jet speeds. Advanced autopilot systems for steady formation flight at 40,000 feet. It could carry 3 times the fuel of a KC-97, fly faster than any bomber in service, and operate above most weather systems. The result was a tanker that didn't just support bombers, it matched them. For the first time, bomber crews could fly at full operational speed, and altitude, rendezvous, refuel, and continue to targets anywhere on the globe, all without compromise. The KC-135 entered service in 1957 and immediately redefined strategic air command operations. The Air Force's new doctrine, known as Operation Chrome Dome, depended entirely on these tankers. Under Chrome Dome, nuclear-armed B-52 bombers flew 24-hour airborne alert missions, constantly orbiting pre-assigned routes near Soviet borders. The idea was simple. If war ever broke out, the bombers were already in the air, beyond the reach of a surprise attack. But to stay aloft that long, they needed constant refueling, sometimes multiple times per mission. That job fell to the KC-135. Each Stratotanker could refuel 2 to 3 bombers per sortie, and entire tanker wings were stationed at bases around the world, from Lajes in the Azores to Andersen Air Base in Guam. For the first time in human history, a nation's Air Force could remain airborne indefinitely. As General Curtis LeMay famously said, "The bomber is the sword. The tanker is the arm that swings it." The KC-135 didn't just serve bombers. With the arrival of jet fighters like the F-100 Super Sabre and F-4 Phantom, the Stratotanker became the lifeline for tactical air power as well. In Vietnam, KC-135s supported tens of thousands of refueling missions, enabling fighters to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, loiter longer, and return home safely. During Operation Linebacker in 1972, the massive bombing campaign over Hanoi Ryu, KC-135s flew so many sorties that one commander called them the most important aircraft we never see. The Stratotanker also played a crucial humanitarian role. When disaster struck distant corners of the world, KC-135s could refuel cargo and rescue planes en route, extending the reach of relief missions. By the 1970s, it had become clear that aerial refueling wasn't just a support role, it was the backbone of global air mobility. Boeing had built the KC-135 with one goal: longevity. Its simple, rugged structure and modular design made it endlessly upgradable. Over the decades, successive variants received new engines, avionics, and structural reinforcements. The original KC-135A, with its smoky turbojets, evolved into the KC-135R, equipped with high-bypass CFM56 engines. quieter, cleaner, and 25% more fuel efficient. Even as its civilian sibling, the Boeing 707, was retired from commercial service, the KC-135 kept flying. By the 1980s, it had logged millions of flight hours and supported nearly every major U.S. air operation. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to Desert Storm, the KC-135 was there, silent, patient, and essential. The KC-135 wasn't just an airplane. It was a strategic multiplier. Every other aircraft's capability depended on it. Without tankers, bombers couldn't reach their targets. Fighters couldn't stay in combat zones, and transport planes couldn't bridge continents. It was the quiet giant that made global air power possible. And remarkably, the KC-135's story still isn't over. Nearly 400 Stratotankers remain in service with the U.S. Air Force today. More than 65 years after their first flight, each one still performs the same job first imagined back in the 1940s, turning a humble cargo design into a machine that redefined what range meant in the jet age. But innovation never stops. As the Cold War waned and technology advanced, the question returned: how do you improve on perfection? The answer would come in the next generation. Larger, faster, and smarter tankers that carried the KC-135's DNA into the 21st century. June 12, 1967, over the Gulf of Tonkin. At 30,000 feet, the air is calm, deceptively so. Below, the world is at war. Above, two aircraft hang motionless in the sky, separated by barely 20 feet and 600 miles per hour of combined speed. The KC-135 Stratotanker holds steady, its engines humming in perfect symmetry. Behind it, a F-105 Thunder Chief fighter slides into position, guided not by radar or automation, but by the eyes and instincts of two men, one in the tanker's tail and one in the fighter's cockpit. In the rear of the tanker, the boom operator lies flat on his stomach, peering through a thick glass canopy. His hands rest on two joysticks, controlling the flying boom, a rigid metal arm as delicate as it is dangerous. Every motion must be exact, a fraction of a second too fast or too far, and the boom could strike the fighter's canopy, rip open a fuel line, or shear away under stress. "Receiver in position," the operator calls. "Roger, steady," comes the reply. "Contact," a soft metallic click. The boom slides home. Fuel begins to flow. The fighter pilot relaxes slightly, watching the fuel gauge rise. For a few brief minutes, both aircraft are joined, not as two machines, but as one organism, moving in perfect harmony through the thin blue atmosphere. Mid-air refueling is often described as mechanical, but to those who perform it, it's deeply human, an act of precision, patience, and psychological control. The pilots must hold their aircraft in a three-dimensional box of air, maintaining formation within inches while compensating for turbulence, crosswinds, and wake vortices. The tanker's slipstream buffets the receiver constantly. Any overcorrection can send the fighter drifting out of alignment or slamming into the boom. Inside the tanker, the boom operator's world is reduced to a window and a moving target. His every motion must be fluid. A single jerky correction can send the boom whipping like a sword. "You don't think about moving it," one veteran said. "You feel it." That sensation, a form of instinctive control, mirrors what WWII gunners discovered when they learned to aim behind the target. It's the same mastery of movement born from repetition until muscle memory takes over. Boom operators train for months to develop this sense. They start with simulators, then move to live flights, practicing hundreds of connections before ever refueling a jet in combat. The training is not just about precision. It's about emotion regulation. The operator must remain calm while performing a task that could kill both crews in a heartbeat. Every successful refueling mission rests on trust, a word repeated in every training syllabus, every squadron briefing. The fighter pilot must trust the tanker pilot to maintain altitude and speed perfectly. The tanker pilot must trust the boom operator to make the connection cleanly. The operator must trust both to hold their flight path, even when weather or turbulence threatens to break formation. One boom operator compared it to surgery. You're touching another airplane at 500 miles per hour. If either of you panics, you both die. That's trust, pure and simple. That trust forms bonds stronger than rank. Many tanker and receiver crews never meet face to face, but when their missions succeed, they call each other brother. Experienced refueling crews describe a moment during flight when everything, fear, motion, noise, fades away. It's a state Japanese martial artists call mushin, or no mind. At that moment, the operator isn't thinking about airspeed, distance, or wind. The boom moves as naturally as a hand reaching for a doorknob. The fighter slides into position without effort. There's no calculation, no hesitation, just action. Psychologists who studied boom operators during the Vietnam War noted a striking pattern. Their heart rates spiked during approach, but once contact was made, they dropped sharply. The anxiety vanished. The connection was focus itself, a physiological synchronization between man and machine. That mental state, cultivated through years of repetition, is what makes air refueling possible. Computers can calculate angles and rates, but only humans can sense when to move and how much. It's intuition built from experience, a balance between control and surrender. To outsiders, refueling might seem routine, just another support mission. But for those who've done it, it's a meditation on trust, control, and composure. Every contact, every transfer, is a moment where physics, technology, and human instinct converge. When it works, nothing seems to move at all. Two aircraft become one, a fleeting symbol of precision in motion. When the refueling is done, the EEE boom retracts, the pilot waves, and the aircraft peel away into the vast blue. No fanfare, no radio applause, just a quiet acknowledgement between professionals who understand that the smallest mistake could have erased them both, and didn't. The ballet ends, but the rhythm continues. Another receiver is already on approach. And somewhere in the tail of a tanker, another boom operator lies prone, eyes fixed on the sky, hands steady as he guides a metal lifeline into place. Keeping humanity's most advanced machines aloft through nothing more than skill, patience, and absolute faith in the invisible thread that connects them. January 17th, 1991, over the Persian Gulf. It's just past midnight. Below, the desert is silent. Above, the night sky flickers with afterburners as wave after wave of coalition aircraft stream toward Iraq. Among them are stealth fighters, bombers, and electronic warfare planes. Hundreds of aircraft moving as one synchronized machine. But none of them would reach their targets without the silent fleet circling high above the Arabian Peninsula. The tankers, dozens of KC-135 stratotankers and KC-10 extenders held formation that night, feeding fuel into the strike package like arteries, pumping lifeblood through a body. Some aircraft took fuel 3, even 4 times before returning home. It was a logistical ballet on a global scale, the direct descendant of those first experiments with the KB-29. The world had changed, but the principle had not. Fuel equals range. Range equals power. By the late 1970s, the KC-135 was still a workhorse, But the Air Force needed something with greater fuel capacity and versatility. Boeing's engineers, once again faced with a problem of endurance, looked to another civilian platform, the DC-10 airliner. The result was the KC-10 Extender, introduced in 1981. It carried nearly twice the fuel load of a KC-135, could refuel, both boom and probe-equipped aircraft, thanks to an added hose and drogue system, and could itself be refueled in flight. A tanker that could drink as well as pour. Where the KC-135 represented precision, the KC-10 embodied abundance. During Operation Desert Storm, the KC-10 fleet delivered over 300 million pounds of fuel, enabling non-stop bomber missions from the continental United States to targets halfway around the globe. The KC-10 turned aerial refueling from a tactical maneuver into a strategic infrastructure the airborne equivalent of a global highway system. Wherever America needed to fly, the KC-10 made the route possible. In the 21st century, the Air Force turned once again to Boeing, this time for a refueling system built for the digital age. The result? The KC-46A Pegasus, derived from the Boeing 767. The Pegasus isn't just a tanker. It's a network node. Its cockpit brims with digital flight systems, satellite uplinks, and remote vision sensors that allow the boom operator to refuel aircraft using 3D cameras and augmented reality screens. It carries advanced defensive systems, encrypted communications, and the ability to act as a flying data relay. In modern warfare, where information is as vital as fuel, the KC-46 serves both, but the soul of the machine remains unchanged. It still follows the design lineage of the KC-97, still carries a boom, still trains operators in the same position that boomers held in 1950. The technology has changed. The choreography hasn't. Aerial refueling's influence has reached far beyond the military. The concept of air-to-air logistics inspired innovations in civilian aviation, from extended-range cargo operations to aerial firefighting, and even the prospect of midair drone recharging. NASA's autonomous refueling tests now use robotic systems to transfer cryogenic fuel between spacecraft. A direct spiritual descendant of the KC-135's boom technology. The same physics that once guided gunners and boom operators now powers orbital refueling depots that will one day sustain lunar and Martian missions. And even in civilian flight training, the discipline of formation flying and precise spatial awareness, lessons learned from tanker crews, remain foundational. Today's engineers are testing what once seemed science fiction: autonomous aerial refueling. Drones can now connect to tankers without human input, guided by laser sensors, GPS, and AI. In 2021, a U.S. Navy drone, the MQ-25 Stingray, successfully refueled a manned fighter jet entirely autonomously, the first time a machine had performed. A task once reserved for the calm hands of a human boom operator. It was a technological triumph, but it also marked a philosophical shift. For nearly a century, the act of mid-air refueling had symbolized trust between people. Now, it was becoming a handshake between machines. And yet, the legacy of the human pioneers remains. The gunners who learned to aim at empty sky, the engineers who rewired cargo planes into fuel tankers, and the pilots who flew within arm's length of another aircraft through turbulence and fear. Every modern system, from the KC-46's digital sensors to the MQ-25's algorithms, is built on the lessons those men learned by feel, through failure and persistence. From Cobham's clumsy looped hoses to the smooth steel boom of the Stratotanker, from the roar of B-29s over Tokyo to the quiet hum of autonomous drones over the Pacific, one truth has endured. Range defines power. Every era has its frontier. oceans, deserts, orbit, and each time, engineers find a way to extend humanity's reach just a little farther. The flying gas station, born out of desperation in the 1940s, became one of the most transformative technologies in aviation history. It redefined logistics. It reshaped global strategy. It even reimagined what distance means. And as the KC-46 soars alongside stealth bombers and drones, one can't help but think back to that first converted cargo plane in 1950, lumbering through the sky with hoses trailing behind it, doing something no one had ever done before. The aircraft may be different now, but the philosophy is the same. When the mission matters and the range is too far, someone or something must carry the fuel to those who dare to go. August 1950. Edwards Air Force Base, California. On the desert runway where it all began, a handful of engineers and pilots watched as a converted cargo plane lifted off into the blazing sky. Its tail carried a long, gleaming refueling boom, a strange appendage for an aircraft once meant to haul crates and mail. But that day, as the plane disappeared into the sun, it was carrying something far heavier than fuel. An idea. That distance could be defeated. That limitation could be engineered away. Would redefine aviation, warfare, and even human ambition. The story of the Airborne refueling station isn't just about machines. It's about people who refused to accept the obvious. Every stage of the journey, from the British tinkerers with their whirling hoses to the American engineers sketching booms on napkins, was an act of defiance against what seemed impossible. Each breakthrough demanded something deeper than technology. Imagination under pressure. A gunner in WWII had once been told to aim not at the target, but ahead of it, to shoot into empty sky and trust that physics would deliver the hit. A decade later, American engineers did something similar. They aimed their innovation not at what existed, but at the space ahead, at the unseen potential of flight itself. They trusted that, if they aimed far enough into the unknown, the world would catch up. In the decades that followed, their invention would keep bombers aloft for 20-hour missions, feed fighters in combat, and even extend the wings of humanitarian aircraft racing to save lives after disasters. The flying gas station became more than a military tool. It became a metaphor for endurance, for sustaining what matters when everything else runs low. And though today's skies are filled with drones, satellites, and jets faster than sound, the same principle endures. Somewhere over an ocean or desert, right now, a tanker and a receiver are locked together in silent partnership. 2 aircraft, 2 crews, joined by a line of fuel and faith. The technology has evolved, but the heart of it remains human. Precision, trust, and the courage to close the gap between what is and what could be. When future engineers build refueling stations in orbit, or when autonomous aircraft sustain one another without pilots, they'll still be echoing that same lesson first learned. In 1950, the one written in sweat and jet fuel and persistence. Progress begins when we dare to aim at empty sky and believe we can hit what isn't there yet.